In the harshest corner of the Rocky Mountains, where temperatures plummet to 70 degrees below zero, a 12-year-old boy faced the unthinkable: complete abandonment. What happened next would challenge everything we believe about human resilience and ingenuity. This is the true story of how one child, armed with nothing but discarded materials and an unbreakable will to survive, built something that defied all expectations. If you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. The winter of 2024 arrived in Montana's Beartooth Mountains with a fury that even the oldest residents couldn't remember. Daniel Morrison was 12 years old when his stepfather's truck stopped at a remote trailhead 20 miles from the nearest town of Red Lodge. The man who had married his mother 3 years earlier turned to him with cold, indifferent eyes. "Get out," Stephen said, his voice flat and emotionless. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached for his backpack, confusion flooding his mind. His mother sat in the passenger seat, her face turned away from him, shoulders shaking with what he assumed were sobs. She said nothing, not a word of explanation, not a goodbye, not even a glance in his direction. "Mom?" Daniel's voice cracked with desperation. The truck door slammed shut before he could finish his sentence. Through the frosted window, he could see his mother's silhouette, still facing forward, still silent. Stephen shifted the truck into gear, and within seconds they were gone, leaving only tire tracks in the fresh snow and a cloud of exhaust that dissipated into the bitter mountain air. Daniel stood there, his thin jacket already proving insufficient against the biting wind. The thermometer on his cheap digital watch read -42 degrees Fahrenheit. He had $17 in his pocket, a half-empty water bottle, 3 granola bars, and a fleece blanket his grandmother had given him years ago before she passed away. The first hour was the worst. Daniel walked along the snow-covered road, convinced they would return. This had to be some cruel joke, some misguided attempt at teaching him a lesson. His stepfather had been harsh before, cold and dismissive, but this seemed impossible even for him. His mother, despite her recent distance and the way she had changed since the marriage, wouldn't truly abandon her only child. But as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple, Daniel understood the horrifying truth. They weren't coming back. His feet had gone numb inside his worn sneakers. The wind cut through his clothing like razor blades made of ice. Daniel's survival instincts, perhaps inherited from his late father, who had been an outdoorsman, finally kicked in. He couldn't stay on the road. He needed shelter immediately. Stumbling through the deepening snow, Daniel made his way toward a cluster of evergreen trees about 50 yards from the road. His lungs burned with each breath of the frigid air. Tears froze on his cheeks before they could fall. Under the densest part of the tree cover, he found a slight depression in the ground where the snow was less deep. Using his hands, now red and stinging, Daniel dug into the snow, creating a small cave-like depression. He remembered something from a survival show he had watched years ago. Snow could actually provide insulation. He worked frantically as darkness fell, his movements becoming slower, clumsier as hypothermia began to set in. Finally, he crawled into his makeshift snow cave, wrapping himself in the thin blanket. His whole body shook violently. He ate 1 granola bar slowly, forcing himself to chew despite his chattering teeth. The sugar gave him a tiny burst of warmth from within. That first night lasted an eternity. Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams filled with memories of better times. His father teaching him to fish in summer streams, his mother laughing as she made pancakes on Saturday mornings, the small apartment they had shared before Stephen entered their lives. When dawn finally broke, Daniel emerged from his shelter, stunned to still be alive. The temperature had dropped even further overnight. His watch now read -58 degrees. Everything hurt. His fingers were white and waxy-looking, his toes completely without feeling, but Daniel Morrison was still breathing. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and betrayal and physical agony, a fierce determination began to grow. If they had left him here to die, he would prove them wrong. He would survive. The area around him revealed itself in the morning light. About a quarter-mile down a steep embankment, he could see what appeared to be an old abandoned mining site. Weathered wooden structures, rusted equipment, and piles of discarded materials dotted the frozen landscape. It looked like it had been left to decay decades ago. Daniel made a decision. If he was going to survive more than a few days, he needed real shelter. And down in that abandoned site, he might find the materials to build it. The descent down the icy slope took over an hour. Daniel slipped and fell repeatedly, each impact driving the cold deeper into his bones. But when he finally reached the bottom, hope flickered in his chest for the first time since the truck had driven away. The mining site was a treasure trove of discarded materials, corrugated metal sheets, wooden beams, old tarps, thick plastic sheeting, rusted tools, and even an ancient potbelly stove lay scattered among the ruins. Everything was covered in ice and snow, frozen solid by decades of mountain winters. But it was there. Daniel's hands were too cold to work effectively. He needed fire. Searching through the debris, he found a metal barrel with a partially open top. Inside, protected from the worst of the weather, he discovered dry wood scraps and old newspapers. His father had taught him to start fires during their camping trips. Those lessons were about to save his life. Using a piece of flint he found among the tools and a rusty metal file, Daniel spent 2 hours trying to create sparks. His fingers were so numb he could barely grip the materials. Tears of frustration streamed down his face, freezing against his skin, but finally, mercifully, a spark caught. A tiny flame appeared in the nest of paper and wood shavings he had prepared. Daniel carefully fed the fire, watching it grow. He held his hands over the flames, crying out as painful sensation returned to his fingers. The warmth was both agony and salvation. As the fire grew stronger, Daniel dragged the metal barrel closer to a partially intact wooden structure that still had 3 walls standing. He would make this his temporary base while he figured out his next move. If you're enjoying the story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me continue creating content. The second day brought new challenges and small victories. Daniel woke before dawn, his fire reduced to glowing embers. The temperature outside his makeshift shelter had fallen to -64 degrees. He carefully fed more wood to the fire, watching the flames dance back to life, providing the only warmth in his frozen world. His water bottle had frozen solid during the night, despite being inside his blanket. Daniel held it near the fire until he could drink, rationing the precious liquid carefully. He ate half of his second granola bar, his stomach cramping with hunger, but his mind understanding the need to make his supplies last. As daylight crept across the mountains, Daniel began exploring the abandoned mining site more thoroughly. The place was larger than he had initially realized, spanning several acres of forgotten industrial debris. Most structures had collapsed under decades of heavy snow, but among the ruins, Daniel found materials that would prove invaluable. He discovered a pile of insulated panels that had once lined the inside of a mining office. Though weathered and damaged, they were still mostly intact. There were dozens of wooden pallets, perfect for creating walls and floors. He found thick rubber conveyor belting that could serve as weatherproofing. Old windows, cracked but still functional, lay buried under snow and rust. But the most important discovery came that afternoon. Deep within one of the collapsed buildings, Daniel found a cache of supplies someone had left behind, perhaps decades ago. There were canned goods, their labels long since rotted away, but the cans themselves intact and sealed. A box of waterproof matches, still dry inside their container. A genuine winter parka, moth-eaten but infinitely better than his thin jacket. Work gloves, several sizes too large but warm. And most importantly, a book. Cold Weather Survival and Shelter Building. Daniel's hands shook as he opened the book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but readable. That night, huddled by his fire, he read by flickering light, absorbing every word. The book explained how to build proper cold weather shelters, how to insulate against extreme temperatures, how to find and purify water, how to identify edible plants, even in winter. The third day, Daniel began to build. He started by selecting a location. The book emphasized the importance of protection from wind and proximity to resources. About 50 yards from his fire barrel, he found the perfect spot. A natural alcove formed by large boulders, facing south to catch maximum sunlight, with dense evergreen trees providing a windbreak on the northern side. Using a rusty shovel he had found, Daniel cleared snow down to the frozen ground. The work was exhausting. Every shovelful felt like it weighed 50 pounds. His muscles, weakened by cold and hunger, screamed in protest. He took frequent breaks to warm himself by the fire, but he kept working. By nightfall, he had cleared an area roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. His hands were blistered and bleeding despite the oversized gloves. His body ached in ways he had never experienced, but he had made progress. The fourth day brought a dangerous setback. While carrying a heavy metal sheet, Daniel slipped on ice-covered rocks. The sharp edge of the metal caught his left forearm, opening a deep gash that bled profusely. Panic seized him as he watched his blood, shockingly red against the white snow, drip from his arm. The survival book had a section on treating injuries. Daniel forced himself to stay calm. He packed snow against the wound to slow the bleeding and numb the pain. Then he tore strips from his old jacket, creating a makeshift bandage. The bleeding eventually stopped, but the wound throbbed with each heartbeat. That night, fever set in. Daniel lay by his fire, shivering despite the flames, his arms swollen and hot to the touch. Infection was setting in, and he had no antibiotics, no way to properly clean the wound. He drifted in and out of delirium, seeing his mother's face in the flames, hearing his father's voice in the wind. But in the morning, the fever had broken. The wound looked terrible, angry and red, but it hadn't gotten worse. Daniel cleaned it as best he could with melted snow and rewrapped it. He was weak and dizzy, but alive. The setback had cost him 2 days. Daniel knew he needed to work faster. The weather forecast on the small emergency radio he had found predicted even colder temperatures in the coming weeks. If he didn't get proper shelter built soon, his luck would run out. He developed a routine. Wake before dawn, feed the fire, eat a small amount of food, warm up, then work on the shelter until exhaustion forced him to stop. Every day he made progress. Every day he learned something new about surviving in this hostile environment. Daniel used the pallets as a foundation, creating a raised floor that would keep him off the frozen ground. He constructed walls using a combination of wooden beams scavenged from collapsed buildings and the corrugated metal sheets. The insulated panels went on the inside of the walls, creating a barrier against the cold. He layered the rubber conveyor belting on the outside as weatherproofing. The work was slow and dangerous. Several times, heavy materials nearly crushed him. Once, a wooden beam he was positioning as a roof support slipped and struck him in the chest, knocking the wind out of him and leaving a bruise the size of a dinner plate. But Daniel learned from each mistake, adjusted his techniques, and kept building. On the 8th day, he managed to install the potbelly stove inside his partially completed shelter. Getting the heavy cast-iron stove into position nearly broke him, but once in place and connected to a chimney he had fashioned from various metal pipes, it transformed everything. The stove radiated heat far more effectively than his open fire barrel. Daniel also learned to supplement his dwindling food supplies. The book taught him how to identify pine needles that could be boiled into tea, providing vitamin C. He found rose hips, frozen but still nutritious, on wild bushes. He set primitive snares, and though it took many tries, eventually caught a rabbit. The meat, cooked over his fire, was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. 2 weeks into his ordeal, Daniel's shelter began to look less like a pile of junk and more like an actual building. The walls stood firm, reinforced with additional supports he had scavenged. The roof, though far from perfect, kept out most of the snow and wind. Inside, the potbelly stove created a small zone of warmth where the temperature actually rose above freezing. But the work was far from over. Daniel's perfectionism, inherited from his father, wouldn't let him settle for good enough. If he was going to survive the winter, and he was now committed to doing exactly that, his shelter needed to be exceptional. The windows presented a unique challenge. He had found 5 old windows, but only 3 were intact enough to use. Daniel carefully installed them on the southern wall, using a putty-like mixture he created from pine resin and snow to seal the gaps. When sunlight streamed through those windows, illuminating the interior of his shelter, Daniel felt a surge of pride that brought tears to his eyes. He insulated the roof using layers of the industrial panels, old blankets he had found, and even dried moss he had carefully scraped from the north sides of trees. On top of this, he placed the corrugated metal sheets, overlapping them like shingles to shed snow and rain. The chimney pipe extended 2 feet above the roof peak, exactly as the survival book recommended. The door was Daniel's masterpiece. He constructed it from the sturdiest wooden planks he could find, reinforcing it with metal brackets. He fashioned hinges from old pieces of mining equipment, a handle made from a section of metal pipe, and most importantly, it sealed tightly with rubber strips around the edges to block drafts. Inside the shelter, Daniel created distinct living spaces despite the small area. A sleeping area with a platform bed made from pallets, elevated off the floor and insulated underneath. A cooking and eating area near the stove. A storage area where he kept his growing collection of supplies. He even fashioned shelves from old boards, organizing his canned goods and tools. By the 3rd week, Daniel had developed a comfortable routine. Each morning, he woke in relative warmth, fed the stove, and prepared a simple breakfast from his supplies. He spent his days improving the shelter, gathering firewood, checking his snares, and exploring the surrounding area for additional resources. The cold remained brutal. Some days, the temperature dropped to -70 degrees, the kind of cold that made breathing painful and turned exposed skin white with frostbite in seconds. But inside Daniel's shelter, with the stove burning, the temperature hovered around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It wasn't comfortable by normal standards, but compared to the world outside, it was paradise. Daniel's appearance had changed dramatically. His face, once soft with youth, had hardened and thinned. His hands, once those of a typical 12-year-old, were now calloused and scarred. His body had lost weight, but the physical labor had built muscle. He looked older, weathered, like someone who had lived years in just weeks. The emotional toll was harder to measure. Some nights, lying in his sleeping bag, Daniel cried. He thought about his mother, trying to understand how she could have abandoned him. He thought about his stepfather's cruelty. He wondered if anyone was looking for him, if anyone cared that he was missing. The loneliness was sometimes worse than the cold. But during the days, focused on survival and construction, Daniel found a strange kind of peace. Out here, his worth wasn't determined by his stepfather's contempt or his mother's weakness. His value was measured in simple, concrete terms, his ability to survive, to build, to endure. One morning in the 4th week, Daniel stood outside his completed shelter, examining his work with critical eyes. The structure was roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, with walls that stood 7 feet tall at their peak. The roof sloped slightly to shed snow. 3 windows let in natural light. The door hung straight and closed securely. The chimney drew properly, keeping smoke out of the interior. The whole structure sat solid and stable, anchored to the ground with stakes and rocks. It wasn't beautiful by conventional standards. The walls were a patchwork of different materials. The roof had patches of different colored metal. The whole thing looked like exactly what it was, a shelter built from discarded materials by desperate hands. But it was strong, it was warm, it was weatherproof. It was home. Leave a comment below about what you think of Daniel's story so far. Daniel had been alone in the mountains for 6 weeks when he first heard the sound of an engine. He was outside his shelter, splitting firewood with a rusty axe he had sharpened on stones when the distant rumble echoed through the valley. His heart leaped. Part of him wanted to run toward the sound, to wave his arms and shout for help. But another part, the part that had grown hard and wary during his isolation, held him back. He watched from behind his shelter as a snowmobile appeared on the ridge above the mining site. The driver, bundled in professional cold-weather gear, stopped and appeared to be taking photographs of the landscape. Daniel remained hidden, conflicting emotions warring within him. This could be rescue. This could be danger. After everything he had endured, the thought of returning to his mother and stepfather filled him with dread. The snowmobile moved on after a few minutes, disappearing back over the ridge. Daniel stood there for a long time, wrestling with what he should do. That night he barely slept, his mind spinning with possibilities and fears. The decision was made for him 3 days later. Daniel was inside his shelter when he heard voices outside. Multiple voices, adult voices. His muscles tensed. Through his window, he could see 4 people approaching, dressed in heavy winter gear, carrying professional cameras and equipment. "Look at this place," a woman's voice said, filled with wonder. "I've been photographing abandoned sites for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this mining operation." "The Historical Society is going to love this," a man replied. "These buildings date back to the 1920s at least." Daniel watched them explore the mining site, taking photographs, examining the old structures. They were clearly here for historical documentation, not searching for him. He could have stayed hidden. They might never have discovered his shelter, tucked away in its alcove. But as Daniel watched them, something shifted inside him. He was tired of hiding, tired of being afraid. He had survived impossible conditions. He had built something remarkable with his own hands. Why should he hide it? Taking a deep breath, Daniel opened his door and stepped outside. The woman spotted him first. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, there's a child!" The 4 adults rushed toward him, their professional composure dissolving into alarm and concern. They overwhelmed him with questions. Who was he? Where were his parents? How long had he been here? Was he hurt? Daniel stood silently for a moment, then simply gestured toward his shelter. "Would you like to see what I built?" What followed was a reaction Daniel would never forget. The 4 adults, 2 photographers, a historian, and a park ranger, stood in shocked silence as they examined his shelter. The woman who had first spotted him, named Sarah, had tears running down her cheeks as Daniel explained how he had constructed each part, solved each problem, survived each challenge. "This is impossible," the ranger, a man named Tom, kept repeating. "You're telling me you built this alone? A 12-year-old kid?" "I'm almost 13 now," Daniel said quietly. They examined every detail, the insulated walls, the properly vented stove, the raised floor, the sealed windows. They marveled at his resourcefulness, his craftsmanship, his ingenuity. The historian, Dr. Patricia Chen, documented everything with photographs and detailed notes. "This needs to be preserved," she said firmly. "This is more than just a survival shelter. This is a testament to human resilience and ingenuity." The truth came out slowly. The adults contacted authorities. Police arrived. Social workers came. Daniel told his story, the abandonment, the survival, the building. The adults listened with expressions that cycled between horror at his treatment and amazement at his achievement. His mother and stepfather were found within days. The investigation revealed Stephen Morrison had significant debts and had viewed Daniel as a financial burden. His mother, Sandra, had fallen into a deep depression and had been manipulated by her husband. Their plan had been to claim Daniel had run away. They had expected the cold to solve their problem within days. Both were arrested. The charges were severe: child abandonment, attempted murder, child endangerment. The case made national news, but it wasn't the criminal charges that captured public attention. It was Daniel's shelter. The photographs and story went viral. News outlets around the world picked up the story. Abandoned boy builds incredible shelter in 70-degree temperatures. A 12-year-old survival home built from trash amazes engineers. Child's ingenuity saves his life in frozen mountains. Engineers and architects examined the photographs, studying Daniel's construction techniques. Many noted that his design showed intuitive understanding of principles they taught in university courses. His use of insulation, his attention to ventilation, his understanding of heat retention, all demonstrated remarkable problem-solving ability. The shelter itself became protected as both a historical site and a monument to human survival. The mining site where it stood was purchased by a conservation trust, ensuring Daniel's creation would be preserved for future generations to study and learn from. Daniel was placed with foster parents, John and Marie Patterson, a couple in their 50s who lived in Billings, Montana. They were kind, patient people who understood that Daniel needed time and space to process his trauma. They didn't push him to talk about his experience. They simply provided safety, warmth, and acceptance. The Pattersons had a workshop in their garage. When Daniel saw it, filled with tools and materials, something in his eyes lit up for the first time since his rescue. John Patterson, a retired contractor, recognized that spark. "Would you like to build something?" John asked. Daniel nodded, and together they began working on projects. Simple things at first: a birdhouse, a small bookshelf. But gradually, as Daniel's confidence grew, the projects became more ambitious. He designed and built a greenhouse for Marie's garden. He constructed an elaborate playhouse for the neighbors' children. Each project helped him process his trauma through the therapeutic act of creation. The first year after his rescue was complicated. Daniel attended therapy twice a week, working through the trauma of abandonment and the psychological impact of his survival ordeal. His therapist, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, specialized in childhood trauma and helped Daniel understand that his survival wasn't just physical, it required emotional healing too. School was challenging. Daniel had missed months of education during his time in the mountains. But that wasn't the hardest part. Other students knew his story. Some treated him like a celebrity, asking endless questions about his experience. Others seemed uncomfortable around him, as if his trauma was contagious. Daniel found himself isolated in different ways than he had been in the mountains. But there were bright spots. His foster parents, John and Marie, proved to be exactly what Daniel needed. They gave him structure without being controlling, support without being smothering. John's workshop became Daniel's sanctuary, a place where he could express himself through building and creating. Marie, a retired teacher, helped Daniel catch up on his schoolwork. She was patient with his struggles, celebrating small victories and never making him feel inadequate when he didn't understand something immediately. Under her guidance, Daniel's grades improved steadily. The legal proceedings against his mother and stepfather dragged on for months. Daniel had to testify, had to recount the night they abandoned him, had to face them across a courtroom. His mother cried throughout the proceedings, repeatedly trying to apologize, to explain. Daniel listened but felt nothing. The woman sitting across from him seemed like a stranger. Stephen Morrison showed no remorse. He sat stone-faced throughout the trial, his lawyer arguing that he had never intended for Daniel to die, that he had simply meant to scare him. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Both were found guilty on multiple charges. Stephen received 15 years in prison. Sandra received 8 years, with provisions for mental health treatment. When the verdicts were read, Daniel felt relief, but not satisfaction. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo what had happened. It couldn't erase the scars, physical and emotional, that he would carry forever. As the months passed, Daniel's story continued to resonate with people around the world. He received thousands of letters from people inspired by his survival, his ingenuity, his resilience. Children wrote to tell him they faced bullying, but his story gave them courage. Adults wrote about their own survival stories. Engineers and architects wrote with technical questions about his construction methods. One letter stood out. It came from Professor James Chen at Montana State University's School of Architecture. He had studied the photographs and plans of Daniel's shelter extensively and was impressed by the intuitive design principles Daniel had employed. He invited Daniel to visit the university and give a presentation about his experience. Daniel was terrified but curious. With John and Marie's support, he agreed. The presentation took place in a lecture hall filled with 200 architecture and engineering students. Daniel stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, and felt his throat close with anxiety. But then he began to talk about the shelter, about solving each problem as it arose, and the anxiety faded. He showed photographs of the construction process. He explained his reasoning for each design choice. He talked about the importance of insulation, ventilation, and heat retention in extreme cold. The students listened in rapt attention. When Daniel finished, the applause was thunderous. The question and answer session lasted nearly 2 hours. Students wanted to know everything: his thought process, his problem-solving methods, his emotional state during construction. Professor Chen approached Daniel afterward with a proposal. "Have you ever thought about studying architecture or engineering?" he asked. Daniel admitted he hadn't thought much about his future at all. He was still focused on surviving each day, on processing his trauma, on learning to trust again. "You have a gift," Professor Chen said, "an intuitive understanding of structural design that most architects take years to develop. I'd like to set up a mentorship program. You could work with our students, share your perspective, and learn from our faculty. No pressure, no commitment, just an opportunity." Daniel looked at John and Marie, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd like that," he said quietly. The mentorship program transformed Daniel's life. Once a week, he traveled to the university with John, spending the day attending lectures, working in the architecture studio, and collaborating with students on design projects. The students treated him as a peer, not as a curiosity. They valued his input, his unique perspective, his practical problem-solving approach. Daniel discovered he loved design work. He loved taking abstract ideas and making them concrete, loved solving spatial problems, loved the satisfaction of seeing a plan become reality. Architecture combined everything he had learned during his survival experience with creative expression and technical knowledge. His confidence grew. The shy, traumatized boy began to emerge as a thoughtful, articulate young man with clear ideas and the ability to express them. He still had difficult days, moments when the trauma overwhelmed him, but they became less frequent. On the 1-year anniversary of his rescue, the Patterson family traveled back to the mining site. The area had been developed into a small educational park with information panels explaining the history of the mining operation and the story of Daniel's survival. His shelter had been carefully preserved, surrounded by a protective fence but visible to visitors. Daniel stood outside his creation, seeing it with new eyes. It looked smaller than he remembered, rougher around the edges, but it still stood strong, a testament to what he had overcome. A young couple with 2 children approached, reading the information panel. The father explained to his kids about the boy who had survived here, who had built this shelter with his own hands. The children listened with wide eyes, asking questions, expressing amazement. Daniel watched them, and for the first time, he understood the broader meaning of his experience. His story wasn't just about him. It was about human resilience, about the capacity to overcome impossible odds, about the strength we discover when pushed to our limits. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and answer any questions. 14-year-old Daniel Morrison stood in the architecture studio at Montana State University, surrounded by blueprints and 3D models. His latest project was a community center designed for extreme cold climates, incorporating all the lessons he had learned during his survival experience. Professor Chen stood beside him, reviewing the design with obvious pride. "This is graduate-level work," the professor said, shaking his head in amazement. "The way you've integrated passive solar heating with these insulation techniques, it's brilliant." Daniel smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes now. 2 years had passed since his rescue, and while the scars remained, he had learned to carry them differently. They were part of his story, not the entirety of it. The mentorship program had evolved into something more formal. Daniel was now officially enrolled in a special program at the university, taking advanced classes while completing his high school education remotely. It was unusual, but Daniel's case had always been unusual. The university recognized his potential and created a path to nurture it. His relationship with the Patterson family had deepened as well. The previous month, they had officially adopted him. When the judge signed the papers, making him legally their son, Daniel had cried, tears of joy this time. He called them Mom and Dad now, and the words felt natural. John Patterson had taught Daniel advanced carpentry and construction techniques. Together, they had renovated the Pattersons' garage, transforming it into a proper workshop with professional-grade equipment. On weekends, they took on projects for neighbors and friends, with Daniel increasingly taking the lead on design and construction. Marie Patterson had helped Daniel catch up academically and then surpass his peers. His grades were excellent now, particularly in mathematics and science. But more importantly, she had helped him learn to trust again, to open up emotionally, to accept love without fear. Daniel's biological mother, Sandra, had been writing to him from prison. Her letters were filled with apologies, explanations, and pleas for forgiveness. Daniel read them carefully, discussed them with his therapist, but hadn't responded. He wasn't ready. Maybe he would never be ready. Dr. Martinez assured him that was okay. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be forced or rushed. Stephen Morrison hadn't written at all. According to the prison records, he had refused to participate in the court-mandated counseling and showed no remorse for his actions. Daniel felt nothing about this. That man was a stranger who had tried to kill him. He deserved no space in Daniel's thoughts. The public attention around Daniel's story had gradually faded, replaced by other news, other viral moments. But within certain circles, survival enthusiasts, architects, child welfare advocates, Daniel remained a significant figure. He occasionally gave presentations about his experience, always emphasizing the lessons about resilience, problem-solving, and the importance of never giving up. One presentation, at a conference for foster and adoptive families, particularly moved him. As Daniel spoke about his journey from abandonment to adoption, about finding a family who chose him, dozens of foster children in the audience listened with rapt attention. After the presentation, several came up to thank him, to share their own stories, to tell him that seeing his survival gave them hope for their own futures. Daniel realized his shelter in the mountains had been more than physical survival. It was a metaphor for the emotional and psychological shelter he had learned to build around himself, a safe space where he could process trauma and construct a new identity. His architectural designs began to reflect this understanding. He became interested in designing spaces for vulnerable populations, shelters for homeless youth, transitional housing for foster children aging out of the system, community centers in struggling neighborhoods. His designs emphasized safety, dignity, and functionality, the same principles that had guided his survival shelter. In the spring of his 15th year, Daniel entered a national student design competition focused on sustainable emergency housing. The challenge was to design temporary shelter that could be quickly constructed in disaster areas using minimal resources. Daniel's design drew directly from his survival experience, incorporating techniques for extreme temperature regulation, modular construction using salvaged materials, and efficient use of space. He won first place. The prize included a scholarship to any architecture program in the country and an internship with a prestigious firm specializing in humanitarian design. The award ceremony took place in Washington, D.C., with representatives from FEMA and the American Institute of Architects in attendance. As Daniel accepted his award, looking out at the crowd of accomplished architects and designers, he thought about the 12-year-old boy abandoned in the frozen mountains. That boy had believed he was worthless, that his own family didn't want him. That boy had been wrong. The trauma of abandonment would always be part of Daniel's story. But it was no longer the defining part. He had transformed his suffering into purpose, his survival into inspiration, his pain into power. The shelter he had built in desperation had become the foundation for a lifetime of building, not just structures, but hope, possibility, and future. 3 years after his rescue, 17-year-old Daniel Morrison stood on a stage in front of 2,000 people at a TED conference in Denver. His presentation, titled "Building Through Crisis: Lessons from Survival," had just concluded to a standing ovation. But it wasn't the applause that moved him. It was what came next. The conference organizers had arranged a surprise. On the screen behind Daniel, a video began playing. It showed his shelter preserved at the mining site, but now it was surrounded by something new, a full-scale educational facility called the Morrison Resilience Center. The video showed classrooms where troubled youth learned construction and survival skills. It showed workshops where engineers and architects studied Daniel's design principles. It showed a museum dedicated to stories of human survival and resilience. And it showed something that made Daniel's breath catch, a scholarship program funded by donations inspired by his story that would send 50 foster children to college each year. "This is what your story has built," the conference organizer said, joining Daniel on stage. "This is the shelter you're building now, not just for yourself, but for thousands of others." Daniel stood speechless, tears streaming down his face. John and Marie Patterson, sitting in the front row, were crying too. This was beyond anything he had imagined. The years since his survival had been transformative. Daniel had graduated high school a year early with honors. He had been accepted to MIT's architecture program with a full scholarship. His designs had been featured in architectural magazines. He had spoken at dozens of conferences and events, but more importantly, he had healed. The nightmares came less frequently now. The anxiety was manageable. He had learned to trust, to love, to hope. He had found his purpose. The Morrison Resilience Center wasn't just a monument to his survival. It was a living testament to the power of transformation. The facility offered programs for at-risk youth, teaching them practical skills while helping them build confidence and resilience. It partnered with child welfare agencies to provide resources for foster families. It conducted research on childhood trauma and recovery. Daniel had been involved in every aspect of its design. The main building incorporated advanced sustainable technologies while maintaining the aesthetic of his original shelter. Salvaged materials were used throughout, each piece telling a story of transformation from waste to purpose. The architecture itself was designed to be therapeutic, with natural light, warm materials, and spaces that felt both safe and inspiring. In the months following the TED Talk, Daniel's life accelerated even further. He deferred his admission to MIT for a year to work full-time at the Morrison Resilience Center. He wanted to be there for its first year, to help shape its programs, to work directly with the young people it served. One afternoon in late summer, Daniel was conducting a workshop on basic construction techniques when a 13-year-old girl named Maya asked him a question that stopped him cold. "Were you scared when you were alone in the mountains?" Daniel looked at her, seeing his younger self reflected in her eyes, the wariness, the hurt, the desperate hope for something better. "I was terrified," he said honestly, "every single day. But I learned something important. Being scared doesn't mean being defeated. Fear can be fuel if you use it right." Maya nodded slowly, processing this. She was in foster care, her fourth placement in 2 years. She had been labeled difficult, troubled, hopeless. But in the workshop, working with tools and materials, she showed remarkable focus and skill. Over the following months, Daniel mentored Maya personally. He taught her advanced techniques, encouraged her ideas, helped her design and build her own projects. He watched her transform, just as he had transformed through the therapeutic power of creation. By winter, Maya had designed and built a small greenhouse for the center. It wasn't perfect. Her welds were rough, her measurements sometimes off, but it worked. It stood solid and functional. When the first plants began to grow inside, Maya's face lit up with pride. Daniel recognized immediately. "I built something that matters," she whispered. "Yes, you did," Daniel agreed, "and you can keep building. You can build anything you imagine." This, Daniel realized, was the true purpose of his survival story. Not just to inspire, but to actively help others discover their own strength, their own capacity to build, to endure, to transform. The scholarship program funded by his story had expanded beyond his wildest dreams. The first 50 recipients had grown to 200. Young people who had aged out of foster care without family support, who faced homelessness and poverty, now had pathways to education and stable futures. They studied engineering, medicine, business, education, and yes, architecture. Daniel stayed in touch with many of them, offering mentorship and support. He understood their struggles in ways few others could. He knew what it meant to feel abandoned, to doubt your worth, to fight for survival. But he also knew what lay on the other side of that struggle: purpose, strength, and the power to help others. On the 5th anniversary of his rescue, Daniel returned to his shelter one final time before beginning his freshman year at MIT. The structure had been meticulously maintained, protected from the elements, preserved exactly as he had left it. Standing inside, touching the walls he had built with desperate, freezing hands, Daniel felt the weight of his journey. He pulled out a small notebook and wrote a letter, not to anyone specific, but to all the frightened, abandoned, desperate children who might one day read it. He wrote about fear and courage, about survival and purpose, about the shelters we build and the lives we construct. He ended with this: "You are stronger than you know. Your circumstances do not define your worth. Your pain can become your purpose. Keep building, keep surviving, keep hoping. You matter." Daniel sealed the letter in a waterproof container and placed it inside a time capsule that would be opened in 25 years. By then, he would be 42 years old. He wondered what that future Daniel would think, looking back at this moment. As he locked the shelter for the last time and walked toward the Pattersons' truck where John and Marie waited, Daniel looked back at the structure one more time. It had saved his life when he was 12 years old. But in a larger sense, it was still saving him, giving him purpose, direction, meaning. The abandoned boy had built more than a shelter. He had built a future, not just for himself, but for thousands of others who would be touched by his story, inspired by his resilience, helped by the programs and scholarships his survival had created. The shelter stood solid against the mountain backdrop, a monument to human endurance and ingenuity. But more than that, it was a promise that survival is possible, that transformation is real, that from the coldest, darkest moments, something beautiful and meaningful can be built. Daniel climbed into the truck, ready for the next chapter of his journey. Behind him, the shelter waited, holding its stories and lessons for future generations. Ahead of him, MIT and a career in architecture beckoned. But most importantly, around him were people who loved him, chose him, believed in him. He was no longer the abandoned boy. He was Daniel Morrison, survivor, builder, architect of his own future. and his story was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts and answering questions. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories.